He flew over 1,400 combat missions. He was shot down 17 times. 17, and every single time, he walked away. He survived burning cockpits, shattered fuselages, crash landings in enemy territory, and bullets that should have killed him a dozen times over. His name was Erich Hartmann, and by the end of World War II, he had shot down 352 enemy aircraft. More than any other pilot in the history of human conflict, before or since. No one has ever come close. Not in Korea, not in Vietnam, not in any war that followed. 352 kills. Verified, documented, real. But here's the thing that most people never talk about. The story of his final flight is not the story you think it is. Because it didn't end in a blaze of glory over Germany. It didn't end with a hero's welcome or a ticker tape parade. It ended in silence, in a prison camp in Siberia. And what happened to Erich Hartmann after the war ended is one of the most disturbing, heartbreaking, and forgotten stories to come out of World War II. This is that story. To understand Erich Hartmann, you have to understand the war he was born into. By 1942, the Eastern Front of World War II was unlike anything the world had ever seen. We're not talking about the Western Front, the beaches of Normandy, the hedgerows of France, the neat historical narratives most people know. The Eastern Front was something else entirely. It was chaos. It was brutal beyond description. It was a war where the rules didn't exist and survival was measured in days, not years. The German Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force were locked in a grinding, relentless air war across thousands of miles of Russian steppe, forest, and frozen wasteland. Pilots flew multiple missions per day, sometimes 5 or 6 sorties before sunset. The aircraft were constantly evolving, constantly improving, and the sky was always full of enemies. It was in this environment, this absolute crucible of aerial warfare, that a 19-year-old German kid from Württemberg arrived at the front in late 1942. He was blonde, he was boyish. He barely looked old enough to shave. His fellow pilots called him Bubi. It's a German nickname. It means kid. That kid would become the most lethal fighter pilot in the history of aviation, and most people in the Western world have never heard his name. Erich Alfred Hartmann was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach, a small town in southwest Germany. His mother, Elizabeth, was a pilot herself, one of the first licensed female pilots in Germany. She taught young Erich to fly gliders when he was just a child. By the time he was 14, he was already an instructor, teaching other kids how to read the wind and feel the air beneath their wings. Flying wasn't something he learned. It was something he absorbed. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 at age 18, went through flight training, and was assigned to Jagdschwader 52, JG-52, on the Eastern Front in October 1942. JG-52 was the most successful fighter wing in aviation history. By the end of the war, its pilots had accumulated over 10,000 aerial victories combined. 10,000. But even in that unit, packed with aces, veterans, killers, Erich Hartmann became something else. His first combat mission did not go well. He lost his leader in the chaos of a dogfight, made a series of reckless decisions, burned through all his fuel trying to keep up with veterans who knew things he didn't, and had to make an emergency landing in a field. His aircraft was undamaged, but Hartmann was grounded for 3 days as punishment. His commanding officer, a seasoned ace named Walter Krupinski, who himself had over 190 kills, watched this young pilot and saw something. Not recklessness. Hunger. Raw, unfiltered hunger to fight. Krupinski took him under his wing, taught him to slow down, to observe, to think before he acted. That lesson changed everything. Because Erich Hartmann didn't just become a better pilot after that. He became something almost scientific about aerial combat. He developed what you might call a philosophy of killing. Most fighter pilots of World War II relied on gunnery skills. The ability to hit a fast-moving target from long range while moving fast themselves. It required extraordinary reflexes and spatial awareness. Hartmann approached it completely differently. He would describe his method later, and it was almost unsettling in its simplicity. He waited. That was the core of it. While others engaged from 400 or 500 meters out, Hartmann would close. He would get so close to his target, sometimes within 50 meters, that it was nearly impossible to miss. He could see the rivets on the enemy aircraft before he opened fire. He called his approach see, decide, attack, break. 4 steps, every single time. See the enemy before they see you. Decide on your attack angle. Attack from close range. Break away before they can respond. It sounds simple. It was devastatingly effective. His first confirmed kill came on November 5, 1942. A Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 ground attack aircraft. The Il-2 was a beast, heavily armored, hard to bring down, absolutely brutal in its role as a tank killer. Hartmann caught one from close range and sent it into the ground. He didn't celebrate long. By that point, the Eastern Front demanded constant movement, constant readiness. There was always another mission. Always. By February 1943, he had 7 confirmed kills. Enough to be noticed. Not enough to be legendary. Then something shifted. In the summer of 1943, the pace of his victories suddenly accelerated in a way that even his fellow pilots found difficult to comprehend. He was scoring multiple kills per day, then multiple kills per mission. On one day in August 1943, he shot down 7 Soviet aircraft in a single day, and then the Soviets started hunting him. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. By 1943, the Soviet Air Force had identified Erich Hartmann. They knew his aircraft markings. They knew his tactics. They put a bounty on his head. Soviet pilots were instructed to prioritize targeting the German pilot flying with the distinctive black tulip marking on his Messerschmitt Bf 109. So what did Hartmann do when he found out enemy pilots were specifically looking for him? He used it. He realized that when Soviet pilots saw his marking, they broke formation. They scattered or they grouped up and came after him aggressively, which broke their tactical cohesion. He used the fear of his reputation as a weapon. There's something almost medieval about that. Like a knight whose reputation on the battlefield clears a path before he even raises his sword. His aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, was already one of the finest fighters of the war. The G-series variant he flew in 1943 and 1944 was quick, responsive, and armed with a 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. In the hands of an average pilot, it was competitive. In the hands of Hartmann, it was devastating. By the end of 1943, he had over 150 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe was running out of medals to give him. But the number that stopped everyone, the number that even his commanding officers struggled to accept, was still coming. On August 24, 1944, Erich Hartmann shot down his 301st enemy aircraft. He became the first pilot in history to reach 300 aerial victories. There was no precedent for it, no framework. Nothing in the history of aviation training, doctrine, or record-keeping had ever accounted for a number this high. He was 22 years old, and the war still had nearly a year left to run. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Because in August 1943, before he reached those staggering numbers, something happened that almost ended the story entirely. During a mission over the Caucasus region, Hartmann attacked a formation of Soviet aircraft and shot down 2 of them. But he followed the burning wreckage too closely, a mistake he rarely made, and his Bf 109 was struck by debris from an exploding aircraft. The engine was damaged. He had no choice but to crash land behind Soviet lines. He was captured. For a few hours, Erich Hartmann, the most dangerous fighter pilot on the Eastern Front, was a prisoner of the Red Army. What happened next sounds almost too extraordinary to believe. But it's documented. While being transported by Soviet soldiers, Hartmann faked a sudden illness, severe abdominal pain, enough to make his captors stop the vehicle. When they did, he ran. He sprinted into the tall grass of the Russian steppe and disappeared. He evaded Soviet search parties for several hours, moving through enemy-held territory on foot. He eventually made contact with advancing German infantry and was returned to his unit. The whole episode lasted less than a day. He was back in the cockpit within 48 hours. His unit couldn't believe it. His commander filed a report on the incident that described Hartmann's escape with a kind of restrained disbelief that tells you everything about the atmosphere at JG-52 at the time. These were men surrounded by death and chaos every single day, and even they found this remarkable. But here's what that episode reveals about Hartmann that the kill numbers don't fully capture. He was not reckless. He was not the kind of pilot who took stupid risks for glory. His escape from Soviet capture wasn't luck. It was presence of mind under the most extreme stress imaginable. It was the same quality that made him survive 17 shootdowns without serious injury. He thought clearly when other men panicked. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were pushing westward in massive numbers. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, running out of aircraft, running out of experienced pilots to fly them. Hartmann kept flying. On April 17, 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended, he achieved his 52nd and final aerial victory, 352. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. Hartmann surrendered, not to the Americans or the British. He surrendered to Soviet forces. Specifically, he flew his remaining pilots and their families to an area he believed would be controlled by American troops. But the situation on the ground was chaotic. The boundaries kept shifting. And the area where he landed was transferred to Soviet control almost immediately after. He walked directly into Soviet captivity. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people, even serious history enthusiasts, don't fully know. The Soviets didn't treat Erich Hartmann like a prisoner of war. They treated him like a war criminal. The charges brought against him were fabricated. The Soviets accused him of destroying 92 collective farms and killing civilians. The charges were baseless. Hartmann was a fighter pilot, engaged aircraft. He didn't target civilians. There is no credible historical evidence supporting any of the charges against him. But the Soviets had reasons for keeping him. They wanted him to help build the East German Air Force. The new communist state needed experienced aviators, and Hartmann was the most experienced fighter pilot alive. They offered him freedom in exchange for cooperation. He refused. Again and again, across years of captivity, he refused. He was held in Soviet prison camps, the Gulag system, for a decade. 10 years while his family waited in West Germany. While his wife, Ursula, the woman he'd been in love with since he was a teenager, waited for a husband who had been told he would never come home. The conditions were brutal. Hartmann organized hunger strikes among German POEs to protest their treatment. For this, he was placed in solitary confinement. For months at a time, in darkness. He was offered his freedom multiple times across those 10 years. Each time, the price was cooperation with Soviet military ambitions. Each time, he said no. There's a record of one meeting with a Soviet officer who offered Hartmann a deal. Train East German pilots, receive a comfortable life, a salary, an apartment, freedom. Hartmann apparently looked at the officer and said that he would not train pilots to fight against his own people. He served the full term. 10 years in Soviet captivity for crimes that never happened. He was finally released on October 24, 1955, 10 years and 5 months after the war ended. He weighed significantly less than when he'd been captured. His health was damaged. But he was alive. He returned to West Germany. He was reunited with Ursula, who had waited for him the entire time. And then, and this is the part that makes this story almost difficult to process, he rejoined the military. The new West German Air Force, the Bundeswehr, was being built from scratch in the 1950s as West EMC. As West Germany rearmed under NATO, they needed experienced officers. They needed pilots who understood aviation, tactics, leadership. They called Erich Hartmann. He came back. He trained a new generation of German pilots. He became a wing commander. He flew jets, the F-86 Sabre, and later the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. But the Starfighter program became a crisis of its own. The F-104 had a catastrophic accident rate in German service. So many crashes, so many pilots killed, that it earned the nickname the Widowmaker in the German press. Hartmann became one of the most vocal critics of the aircraft within the Bundeswehr. He believed the F-104 was being pushed on German pilots before they were adequately trained for it. He said so, loudly, to his superiors. It ended his military career. He was pushed out quietly, without ceremony, in 1970. He spent the rest of his life in relative privacy. He gave interviews. He met with aviation historians. He spoke about the war with a candor that was unusual for men of his generation and his background. He talked about the Soviet pilots he'd faced. He respected them. He said they were tough, determined, and that by the end of the war, the quality of Soviet pilots had improved dramatically. He was not dismissive of his enemies. He talked about the kill numbers with a kind of detachment that people found either deeply impressive or slightly unsettling. Depending on their perspective, he never glorified them. He treated them as the product of a system, a war that put young men in cockpits and told them to survive. He talked about the 10 years in Soviet captivity as the defining experience of his adult life. More than the dogfights, more than the medals, more than the 352 victories. Because in the prison camps, there was no skill to deploy, no tactic to employ. There was only endurance, and the question of what a man holds on to when everything else is taken from him. For Hartmann, the answer was simple. He held on to Ursula. And he held on to the decision not to betray his principles. He died on September 20th, 1993, in Weil im Schonbach, Germany. He was 71 years old. His record -352 aerial victories has never been approached. The second highest ace in history, Gerhard Barkhorn, had 301. Also a German pilot, also from JG-52, also on the Eastern Front. The third highest ace in history had 275. To put Hartmann's record in perspective, the highest-scoring American ace of World War II, Richard Bong, had 40 victories. The highest-scoring British ace had 41. These were extraordinary pilots, elite warriors. Hartmann had 8 times their numbers. There are historians and aviation experts who have spent careers trying to explain this. The Eastern Front flying conditions, the sheer volume of sorties, the density of aircraft in that theater, all of these factors contributed. But none of them fully explain it. Some things resist explanation. What we can say with certainty is this. Erich Hartmann flew more combat missions than most pilots could survive. He was shot down or forced to land due to enemy action or mechanical failure 17 times. He walked away from all of them. He was captured and escaped. He was imprisoned for a decade for crimes he didn't commit. He refused to compromise his principles, even when the price was years of his life. And through all of it, the fire, the frozen camps, the bureaucratic betrayals at the end of his Bundeswehr career, the thing that people who knew him remembered most was not the ferocity. It was the calm. Pilots who flew with him said the same thing again and again. In the chaos of a dogfight, with aircraft spinning and burning and radio chatter exploding in every direction, Hartmann was quiet, focused, unhurried. Like a man who had decided, somewhere early in his life, that panic was a choice, and he had simply chosen not to make it. That quality, that stillness under the worst possible pressure, might be the thing that explains the 352 victories, more than any tactical analysis ever could. Because in the end, aerial combat at that level isn't just about reflexes and marksmanship. It's about who keeps thinking clearly when thinking clearly seems impossible. Erich Hartmann kept thinking clearly. for 1,404 combat missions, for 10 years in a Soviet prison camp, for the entirety of a life that should have ended a dozen times over. And the final flight of the deadliest pilot in history wasn't over Germany. It wasn't against a Soviet formation above the burning steppe. It was a quiet retirement in a small German town, far from the cameras,